Two twin nuns vanished without a trace in 1977. Everyone assumed they'd simply left their religious life behind. But when a hunter found something buried deep in the woods 15 years later, it revealed a truth so horrifying that it would change everything. Daniel Morrison, now 35, sat in the cramped kitchen of his studio apartment, staring at the steam rising from his untouched coffee. The morning light filtered through grimy windows, casting pale shadows across newspaper clippings that covered his small table. Headlines from 1977 stared back at him. Twin nuns missing from St. Catherine's. Search continues for beloved sisters. Did the Morrison sisters choose to leave? That last headline had always burned in his chest. The community had whispered about it for months after Rebecca and Rachel disappeared. Two young women who had seemed so devoted to their calling, vanishing on the very night they were supposed to take their final vows. Some said they got cold feet. Others suggested they'd fallen in love and run away together with men from town. Daniel had never believed it. Not his sisters. The phone shattered his morning silence. "Mr. Morrison, this is Detective Walsh with the State Police. We received a call about some evidence that might be related to your sister's case." Daniel gripped the phone tighter. "What kind of evidence?" "A hunter found what appears to be a nun's habit and prayer book buried in the woods about 12 miles from Cedar Valley. The prayer book has Sister Rebecca Morrison written inside." The coffee cup slipped from Daniel's other hand, shattering against the linoleum floor. After all these years of silence, suddenly there was something. But what did it mean? "I need to see it," Daniel said, his voice barely steady. "We're sending a car to pick you up now, if that's acceptable." 20 minutes later, Daniel found himself in the back of a police cruiser, watching familiar mountains roll past the window. He hadn't been back to Cedar Valley since the memorial service 5 years ago, a hollow ceremony for two women whose bodies had never been found, whose fate had never been determined. The crime scene was deep in the Whitmore National Forest, accessible only by a winding dirt road that hunters use during deer season. Yellow tape marked off a small clearing where forensic technicians worked methodically around a shallow depression in the earth. Detective Walsh was a tall woman in her 40s with kind eyes that had seen too much. She approached Daniel as he stepped out of the car. "Mr. Morrison, I want to prepare you. What we found raises more questions than it answers." Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. They walked to a table where the evidence had been carefully laid out. The nun's habit was mostly fragments now, black cloth that had deteriorated over time. But the prayer book was unmistakably Rebecca's. He recognized her careful handwriting in the margins, the way she dotted her I's with tiny crosses. "This was definitely my sister's," he said softly. "She carried this book everywhere." "Here's what's puzzling," Detective Walsh said, pulling out her notes. "The burial pattern suggests these items were interred sometime after your sisters disappeared, not during their disappearance. The soil analysis shows distinct layering. These were buried maybe 6 months to a year after they went missing." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means someone wanted us to find these items, or they were disposing of evidence later. Either way, this changes the investigation." A technician approached with several evidence bags. "Detective, we've got some interesting findings. There's pollen embedded in the fabric, mountain laurel and rhododendron, both species that bloom in late spring. But your sisters disappeared in October." "So the habit was somewhere else during blooming season?" Walsh asked. "Exactly. And there's something else. Soil particles in the fabric don't match the soil here. They contain higher iron content, more consistent with soil found in the eastern part of the county." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "So someone moved these items from somewhere else?" "That's what it looks like. We're treating this as a homicide investigation now," Detective Walsh explained. We'll be reopening the case and following every lead." As they drove back toward town, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a mixture of hope and dread. For the first time since 1977, there was evidence that something had happened to his sisters, but it also meant they hadn't simply chosen to leave their religious life behind. The old St. Catherine's Parish looked smaller than Daniel remembered. The white stone building sat on a hill overlooking Cedar Valley, its bell tower reaching toward gray November clouds. He sat in his rental car for several minutes, gathering courage before walking up the familiar path. Father Miguel Santos had replaced Father Brennan 7 years ago, bringing a warmth and energy that had revitalized the aging congregation. Daniel found him in the rectory, going through old parish records. "Mr. Morrison," Father Santos looked up with surprise. "I heard about the discovery in the woods. This must bring back difficult memories." "I'm trying to understand what happened," Daniel replied. "I was hoping you might help me piece together that night. Do you have the records from October 1977? Father Santos nodded solemnly and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been reviewing these myself since the police called. Your sisters were supposed to take their final vows on October 15th. The ceremony was scheduled for the next morning. But they never seemed uncertain about their calling," Daniel said. "The newspaper speculation about them having doubts, that never made sense to me. From what I can see in Father Brennan's notes, Rebecca and Rachel were among his most devoted novices. In fact," Father Santos paused, flipping through pages. "Here it is. Father Brennan wrote that Rebecca had been experiencing what she called divine visions in the weeks before their disappearance. She was more committed than ever. This contradicted everything the newspapers had suggested. Did anyone else know about these visions? According to the notes, yes. There was concern among some parishioners that Rebecca was becoming too intense in her devotion. Father Brennan mentions counseling her about maintaining balance. Who was concerned? Father Santos consulted the records. Several people, it seems. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, she's passed now, felt Rebecca was becoming otherworldly, and he hesitated. There's a note about Thomas Garrett expressing worry about both sisters' welfare. Thomas Garrett? One of our most generous donors. He's been contributing to the church for decades, though he's not officially a member. Lives out on Mining Road. Father Brennan wrote that Mr. Garrett had approached him several times about the sisters, claiming he was concerned about their extreme devotion. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Is he still around? Oh yes. He's quite elderly now, but still contributes regularly. Very private man, very wealthy from some family inheritance. I'd like to speak with him. Father Santos looked uncomfortable. I should probably call him first. He's particular about visitors. That evening, Daniel sat in his hotel room with a growing sense of unease. He'd convinced Father Santos to give him Garrett's address, but something about the man's sudden appearance in his sister's story bothered him. Why would a non-member of the church be so concerned about two novice nuns? He decided to do some research first. The Cedar Valley Library had archived copies of old newspapers, and Daniel spent hours going through them. Thomas Garrett's name appeared occasionally in society pages, donations to various causes, attendance at charity events. Always alone, always described as a prominent local philanthropist. But in a 1976 issue, Daniel found something that made his blood run cold. A small photograph from a church fundraising dinner. In the background, barely visible, was Thomas Garrett, staring directly at Rebecca and Rachel with an expression that Daniel could only describe as hungry. The next morning, Daniel drove out to Mining Road with a knot in his stomach. The Garrett house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by dense forest that stretched for miles without another home in sight. It was larger than he'd expected, a sprawling colonial on what appeared to be a vast inherited estate completely isolated from any neighbors. The property felt like its own private world, with well-maintained grounds and several outbuildings scattered throughout the tree line. As he parked near the front door, a man emerged from what looked like a garden shed behind the house. Thomas Garrett was tall and lean, with silver hair and an expensive cardigan. He approached Daniel's car with measured steps, his pale blue eyes alert and cautious. "Can I help you?" Garrett's voice was cultured but wary. "I'm sorry to bother you," Daniel said, getting out of the car. "I'm Daniel Morrison. Father Santos suggested I speak with you about my sisters, Rebecca and Rachel Morrison." Something flickered across Garrett's face, too quick to interpret, but definitely there. The Morrison sisters, such a tragedy. I remember them well. Beautiful young women, so devoted to their calling. His voice carried genuine sadness. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Morrison. I always hoped they would return safely." "You knew them personally?" "Not personally, no, but I attended services regularly and admired their dedication. I actually spoke with Father Brennan about my concerns regarding their intensity. They seemed to be pushing themselves too hard spiritually." Daniel studied Garrett's face. The man seemed sincere, even concerned. "What kind of concerns?" "Rebecca in particular seemed to be experiencing religious ecstasy that worried me. I've seen such devotion before. It can lead to dangerous decisions. I wondered if someone should counsel moderation." They talked for 20 minutes about the sisters, the church, and the night they disappeared. Garrett was knowledgeable about the investigation, sympathetic about Daniel's long search, and seemed genuinely puzzled by their disappearance. "I always assumed they had simply stepped away from religious life," Garrett said. "Young women sometimes realize that such devotion isn't sustainable. Perhaps they found love, started families elsewhere." As Daniel drove away, he felt confused. Garrett seemed like exactly what he claimed to be, a concerned parishioner who had worried about two young nuns' well-being. The man was known in the community as something of a recluse, someone who preferred his privacy and rarely socialized despite his generous donations. His isolated property made sense for someone who valued solitude. There was nothing obviously sinister about him, nothing that suggested involvement in their disappearance. But something still nagged at Daniel. Maybe it was the way Garrett had said, "beautiful young women," with just a hint too much appreciation, or the fact that his concern had been specifically about their intensity rather than their safety. That afternoon, Detective Walsh called with an update. "We've been analyzing the soil samples from your sister's habit," she said. "The iron-rich soil is consistent with an area in the eastern part of the county, specifically the area around Mining Road." Daniel's heart stopped. "Mining Road? You know it?" "I was just there this morning, talking to a man named Thomas Garrett." There was a pause. "Mr. Morrison, I thought we discussed you not conducting your own investigation." "I know, but he was mentioned in the church records. He seemed genuinely concerned about my sisters." "We'll check him out properly. In the meantime, I have other news. We interviewed Mrs. Catherine Wells. She was Catherine Murphy in 1977, worked as a night clerk at the Cedar Valley Inn. She remembers something she never told police at the time." "What?" "On the night your sisters disappeared, she saw a dark sedan driving slowly past the inn multiple times between 10 p.m. and midnight. She thought it was odd because the driver seemed to be watching the church across the street." "Did she see who was driving?" "A man, well-dressed, probably middle-aged. She didn't get a good look at his face, but she remembered thinking he seemed out of place, too wealthy for Cedar Valley." Daniel felt the pieces clicking together in a way that terrified him. "Detective, I think you need to get a warrant for Thomas Garrett's property." "Based on what evidence?" The soil analysis points to his area. He had unusual interest in my sisters. He fits the description of the man in the sedan. And Daniel paused. There was something about the way he talked about them. Something not quite right. I'll look into it, but I need more than suspicion. That evening, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Garrett's property, all those outbuildings, all that isolated land. If someone wanted to hide something, it would be the perfect place. For the next 3 nights, he found himself driving back to Mining Road after midnight, parking on the logging road to watch the property. The first night, he saw nothing unusual. The second night, he noticed that Garrett seemed to keep odd hours, lights moving through the house well past 2 a.m. On the third night, his patience was rewarded. At 2 a.m., a light came on in one of the outbuildings, not the garden shed he'd seen earlier, but a smaller structure set back in the trees. A few minutes later, Garrett emerged from the main house carrying what looked like a tray of food. He walked to the outbuilding, unlocked several locks, and disappeared inside. Daniel's heart began to pound. Why would someone need multiple locks on what appeared to be a storage shed? And why bring food there at 2 a.m.? He waited until Garrett had gone back into the main house, then crept through the forest toward the outbuilding. It was farther from the house than it had appeared, tucked behind a stand of pine trees that provided natural concealment. Up close, the building looked more substantial than a typical shed. The walls appeared to be reinforced stone, thick enough to muffle any sound from within. There were no windows, and Daniel realized this structure had been specifically designed for containment. Most alarming of all, the door was secured not just with the locks Garrett had used, but also with a heavy bar that could only be operated from the outside. Daniel pressed his ear to the door but heard nothing. He tried to peer through gaps in the boards but saw only darkness. Frustrated and increasingly certain that something terrible was happening here, he began to circle the building looking for another way to see inside. Behind the structure, he found what looked like a ventilation grate set low in the wall. It was partially concealed by overgrown bushes, but when Daniel cleared them away and peered through the metal slats, he could see a faint light below. The building had a basement. His hands shaking, Daniel tried to angle his view to see more of the underground space. The light seemed to be coming from the far end of what looked like a long, narrow room. He could make out some kind of furniture, beds perhaps. And then he heard it. The sound that made his blood freeze. A woman's voice, humming softly. Daniel jerked back from the grate, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Someone was down there. Someone was alive in Thomas Garrett's underground prison. He fumbled for his cell phone, hands trembling as he dialed 911. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" "I need police at 1247 Mining Road immediately," Daniel whispered. "I think someone is being held captive here." "Sir, can you speak up? I'm having trouble hearing you." "I can't speak louder," Daniel hissed. "The suspect might hear me. Just send police now. I think this is connected to the Morrison sisters case from 1977. Police are on their way. Can you get to a safe location?" Daniel was about to respond when a hand grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. Thomas Garrett stood behind him, no longer bothering to maintain his kindly facade. His face was a mask of cold fury, and he held a pistol. "You should have accepted the simple explanation," Garrett said quietly. "They chose to leave. Why couldn't you let it be?" Daniel tried to run, but Garrett was surprisingly strong for his age. "Don't make this harder on yourself," Garrett said, pressing the gun against Daniel's back. "Or on them." "Let me go," Daniel said. "The police are already coming." "I know. I heard your call." Garrett pushed him toward the building. "Which means we need to resolve this quickly." Daniel woke up in darkness, his head throbbing and his wrists bound behind his back. He was lying on a concrete floor in what felt like a small room. As his eyes adjusted, He began to make out details. Stone walls, a single bare light bulb overhead, and 2 narrow beds along the far wall. On the beds, 2 women sat watching him with expressions of shock and recognition. Even after 15 years, even in the dim light, Daniel knew them immediately. Rebecca? Rachel? Danny? Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "Oh my God, Danny, is it really you?" The sisters were alive, but they looked like shadows of the women he remembered. They were thin and pale, wearing simple gray dresses instead of their religious habits. Their hair, which had been cut short for their religious life, had grown long and unkempt. But their eyes still held the gentle strength that had always defined them. "How did you find us?" Rachel asked, her voice hoarse with disuse. "A hunter found Rebecca's prayer book buried in the woods. The police reopened your case." Daniel struggled against his bonds, trying to sit up. "The police know where I am. They'll be here soon." "Thomas said he buried those things far from here," Rebecca said. "He told us no one would ever find them, that everyone would assume we'd chosen to leave religious life. He kept you here all this time?" Daniel's voice cracked with emotion and rage. The sisters exchanged a look that spoke of shared trauma too deep for words. "He took us from the convent garden that night," Rachel said quietly. "We were praying before the ceremony the next morning. He came up behind us with some kind of drug. When we woke up, we were here. He's obsessed with us," Rebecca added. "He says God sent us to him, that we're meant to be his companions. He built this place years before he took us. He planned everything. The walls are thick stone. No one can hear us from above. And Danny," her voice broke, "he told us that if either of us ever tried to escape, he would kill the other one immediately. We couldn't risk each other's lives." Daniel felt sick. "Has he hurt you?" "Not physically," Rachel said carefully. "He's convinced himself that he's protecting us, caring for us. But Danny, we've been prisoners for 15 years. We've missed our whole lives." "I never stopped looking," Daniel said, tears streaming down his face. "I never gave up hope." Before either sister could respond, they heard footsteps on the stairs above. Thomas Garrett descended into the basement, now carrying the pistol openly. He looked disheveled and agitated, no longer the composed man Daniel had met at the front door. "The police are surrounding the house," he said matter-of-factly. "I can see their lights through the trees. I suppose this is the end." "Let them go," Daniel said. "You can still do the right thing." Garrett laughed bitterly. "The right thing? I've spent 15 years doing the right thing. I saved them from a life of loneliness and deprivation. I gave them comfort, safety, purpose." "You kidnapped them," Daniel said. "You stole their lives." "I preserved their beauty," Garrett snapped. "Do you know what would have happened to them in that convent? They would have grown old and forgotten, wasted their gifts serving an absent God. Here they remained perfect, pure." The sound of sirens was getting closer now, accompanied by the rumble of multiple vehicles coming up the gravel driveway. "Thomas," Rebecca said gently, "you know this is wrong. You've always known. Let us go home." For a moment, something human flickered in Garrett's eyes. He looked at Rebecca with an expression of genuine anguish. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't live without you." "You'll have to," Rachel said firmly, "because this ends now." The basement suddenly filled with light as police flashlights illuminated the stairs. "Police!" Detective Walsh's voice echoed off the stone walls. "Drop your weapon!" Garrett turned toward the stairs, raising his pistol. Daniel used the distraction to throw himself forward, knocking into Garrett's legs and sending him stumbling. The gun went off, the bullet ricocheting harmlessly off the stone ceiling. Officers swarmed into the basement, quickly subduing Garrett and securing the scene. Detective Walsh knelt beside Daniel, cutting his bonds with a knife. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "I'm fine," Daniel said, rubbing his wrists. "But my sisters, they need medical attention. They've been here for 15 years. As paramedics checked over Rebecca and Rachel, Daniel sat on the basement steps and watched his sisters emerge into daylight for the first time since 1977. They clung to each other, squinting in the afternoon sun, free but forever changed by their ordeal. "Thank you," Rebecca said to him as they waited for the ambulance. "Thank you for never giving up." "I told you I'd find you," Daniel said, remembering a promise he'd made when they entered the convent 20 years earlier. "I told you I'd always be your little brother, no matter what." 3 months later, Daniel sat in the front pew of St. Catherine's Parish, watching his sisters light candles in memory of the 15 years they'd lost. The church was packed for their first public appearance since their rescue. The entire community had come to witness their return and ask forgiveness for ever doubting their devotion. Rebecca and Rachel had spent weeks in the hospital, then months in counseling, slowly readjusting to a world that had changed dramatically during their captivity. The Catholic Church had granted them a dispensation from their vows, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances of their situation. They were different now, quieter, more cautious, but somehow stronger too. Their faith had survived Thomas Garrett's twisted obsession, refined by suffering into something unbreakable. As they walked back to their seats, Rachel squeezed Daniel's hand. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" she whispered. "I don't know," Daniel replied honestly, "but we're together. That's what matters." After the service, as the three siblings walked down the church steps together, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: complete peace. The questions that had haunted him for 15 years were finally answered. The sister-shaped holes in his heart were filled. Thomas Garrett had been sentenced to life in prison without parole. The investigation had revealed the true scope of his obsession. Rooms in his house filled with photographs of Rebecca and Rachel taken with telephoto lenses, journals documenting their daily routines before the kidnapping, and detailed architectural plans for their underground prison that dated back 5 years before their capture. But that was over now. The monster was caged, and the sisters were free. As they reached Daniel's car, Rebecca turned back to look at the church. "I had a dream while we were down there," she said quietly. "Every night for 15 years, I dreamed that you would find us, that you would never stop looking." "Faith," Rachel added with a small smile. "Sometimes it's all we have." Daniel started the engine and pulled away from St. Catherine's, his sisters beside him at last. In the rearview mirror, he watched the church disappear around a bend in the road, taking with it the ghosts of 15 years of unanswered prayers. They were going home. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, give it a like, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.